All right. This is a talk from my Biosci 700 phylogenetics course. It's on the Matzke 2016 science paper on the evolution of anti-evolution. And so I'll just be talking through what led me to the position where I produced this sort of strange paper, and then talk a little bit extra about the methods that were used in this paper and the kind of data that went into it, since that's what we're focusing on in this phylogenetics class. So January 2016, this paper came out, The Evolution of Anti-Evolution. I'm just noticing now that there's on the front cover, right, there's a frozen SARS vaccine jar, right? So this is back when people were worried about SARS-1, instead of now we're in SARS-CoV-2, of course. But back in 2016, there was obviously still a lot of research going on about SARS-1, which caused an outbreak in 2003, I think. All right, so the evolution of anti-evolution. This cartoon here gives a little bit of the context, and so it's worth taking a minute to read it. This is an early Bloom County cartoon. Bloom County was a well-known cartoon in the United States in the 1980s. It had kind of a left-wing perspective, but you can see that here, this is in the cartoon. There's it's about a trial over something called scientific penguinism. And Opus the penguin there was the main character in Bloom County. And but there were, in the cartoon, there was a school district trying to teach scientific penguinism. I forget what exactly the idea was. But this was a parody of an actual court trial that was actually going on in the US in the early 80s. This was actually a parody of a California case, but a real court trial happened a year later in 1981. There was a court trial over the teaching of scientific creationism. So scientific penguinism is a parody of scientific creationism. There was a whole federal court case in Arkansas, which we'll talk about in a minute. And there was, later on in 1987, there was a Supreme Court case on teaching creationism in the US. And so all of this happened while I was a kid, and I didn't know about it, but I found out about it later on. Anyway, you can see that the sort of wrap up of the cartoon is pretty much parody. This expert witness says penguin evolution is a fib. The state rests, but the guy won't stop. He says the earth isn't round either, and the lawyer says save it. He says, yep, the earth is shaped like a burrito. And the judge then says, hear ye, my decision regarding the propriety of teaching penguin evolutionary origins in school is thus clear the court, you loons. This is freaking ridiculous. And he says, great Scott, I lost control. All this evolution silliness has gotten to me. I feel like a total ape, says Opus. So that's the joke. I did this work while I was at the Australian National University in Canberra. But my real professional work in this area of evolution education starts back at the National Center for Science Education, which you'll hear about in a minute. All right, so the National Center for Science Education is a US-based nonprofit, and it was really a watchdog group devoted to defending the teaching of good science in the schools. For a lot of its history, the big science issue was teaching evolution in the US. There were many fights about that, which we'll see. Nowadays, it's actually shifted more towards issues like climate change, vaccine denialism, because those are the hot topics now. But for many years, throughout the 80s and 90s and 2000s, evolution was the big issue. We had this cartoon up in the office at this nonprofit. It's a Far Side cartoon with a crisis clinic going over a waterfall on fire. That's often what it felt like there, because there are continual challenges to teaching high quality science in the US. There's continual attempts to politically interfere and for political benefit. All right, so the story, my role in this story really starts around 2004. I was a young, I'd finished a master's degree in a field I wasn't particularly into. I somehow got a job at the National Center for Science Education. And in 2004, when I started, it turned out to be right when this issue was peaking. In the actual newsstands in November 2004 was the National Geographic magazine, a famous science magazine, and they had this cover, Was Darwin Wrong? And people like me would freak out. They're like, oh my God, not National Geographic. They're not going over to the pseudoscience side. When you looked inside, right, you see this. No, the evidence for evolution is overwhelming. And so this was relieving. And David Quammen, who's a pretty good science writer, he wrote a great article on what is the evidence for evolution for the general public. But other scientific magazines really, sort of lost it a little bit over this issue. Scientific American, right, had this parody cover in their April 1st issue of 2005. They said, "Is the Earth flat? A balanced debate. 15 good points by creationists. The myth of the atom. Let's just ignore CO2. Reason schmeason." And so this issue, this wasn't their main cover. This was a fake cover they put inside the issue, but still, it really reflected their point of view on this. They really had it with the anti-evolutionists. This issue in the U.S., part of the reason people were losing their patience in the 2000s was the issue anti-evolutionism and teaching evolution in schools came up again in the 2000s, but it wasn't even the first wave. There was a big wave in the early 80s when that Bloom County cartoon happened with scientific penguinism, and there were previous smaller waves, and there was another huge wave in the 1920s. So this issue, is older than any actual humans involved in it. It has been going for decades and decades in the US. So I might as well give you a little brief history on this. This issue goes back to the Scopes monkey trial in Dayton, Tennessee in 1925. And if you're ever in Tennessee and the sort of northern part of the South of the US, basically, you should visit Dayton, Tennessee and look at the museum of this actual court trial that actually happened. Here's the Anti-Evolution League, who say that teaching evolution is, bringing hell to the high schools. And this issue was really launched into public view by William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan had been a US Secretary of State during World War I. He'd been an isolationist. He didn't want to intervene in World War I. What did he do? He ran for president 3 times and lost. He was a prairie populist. He gave a famous speech saying that the farmers of the US shouldn't be crucified on a cross of gold. He was lobbying to move from the gold standard for money to the silver standard for money, basically a liberal money policy. He was a man of the people in many ways, but he was also kind of a blowhard. He's been compared in some ways to Trump. He had a bit of the isolationist, populist aspect to him, although I think he was really a far more serious person than Trump was. But after his political career, towards the end of his life, he launched one more crusade around the country, and this was a crusade against evolution. He became convinced that evolution had led the Germans in World War I, right? This is before the Nazis, but the World War I Germans, he said, had been the reason they started the war was that they had been led astray by evolution and by biblical criticism, right? The academic higher criticism of the Bible, which had revealed, right, that the Bible wasn't really just composed by people divinely inspired. It was clearly a work that had been copied and modified over time in different parts of the Bible, right? Or sometimes the same chunks have been duplicated and rewritten under different editors. That kind of research really offended the evangelical Christians in the US, and he claimed this had caused World War I. And so he said, we need to get rid of higher criticism of the Bible, but in schools, we need to get rid of evolution, he said. Now, the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, only got started during World War I. Their original mission was to protect people who were being prosecuted for being anti-war. So in that sense, ACLU was actually on the same side as William Jennings Bryan. After World War I ended, they needed new issues and they wanted to raise their profile. And so the ACLU, just check here, yep. The ACLU put out an ad. They heard about these anti-evolution laws that William Jennings Bryan was promoting, and they put out an ad to challenge these laws. And this led to a court challenge to a Tennessee law. Tennessee passed one of William Jennings Bryan's laws. They banned the teaching of evolution, and the ACLU filed suit. They got a teacher to challenge the law, John Scopes. So he went and taught evolution in class. And then the prosecution, the local state prosecutor had to come and prosecute this guy. The fine was going to be $100 if he was found wrong. But the ACLU brought their top attorneys, and they brought a famous attorney called Clarence Darrow to come speak and or to defend John Scopes. And the prosecution brought in William Jennings Bryan himself, who hadn't been in a courtroom in decades, to come be one of the prosecutors. And so this set up a battle of titans two of the most famous attorneys in the country, battled in this small courthouse in Tennessee. The trial was broadcast on radio across the country. Radio was a new thing. They actually, dragged wires down from Chicago so that they could broadcast this back to Chicago. It was the first trial of the century. Now, what happened was William Jennings Bryan was embarrassed by Darrow. The media panned the anti-evolutionists as just backwoods fundamentalists. William Jennings Bryan himself died a few days after the trial. He'd been an old man and not very healthy. But legally speaking, the ACLU actually lost. John Scopes was convicted. It was overturned on appeal on a technicality. The fine should have been $50 instead of $100. So Clarence Darrow technically won the case, but the law banning evolution wasn't overturned. And bans on evolution actually remained in many, many US states. All right, so this continued for many years. There were fights over teaching evolution, over these evolution bans that were overturned in the 1960s in the US Supreme Court. After bans on teaching evolution were overturned, there were attempts to teach alternatives to evolution. So we had creation science was pushed in the 70s and 80s. Attempts to teach scientific creationism were thrown out by courts in the 1980s as being a government establishment of religion. The US Constitution, the First Amendment, guarantees freedom of the press, freedom of speech, but it also says government shall make no law respecting establishment of religion. And so this is religious disestablishment. It's quite a strict rule that says the government can't promote a particular religious view. And on that basis, it was ruled that creation science was a religious view and it got tossed out. So after that happened, in the 1990s, we started seeing something called intelligent design. We called it intelligent design creationism, but the intelligent design proponents really swore up and down that they weren't, promoting the old creation science. They weren't promoting a religious view. They were promoting the scientific view that some unknown intelligence had designed life, right? And so this point of view was promoted throughout the 1990s, and eventually it got passed by a school board in Dover, Pennsylvania, which is right there. It's only a couple of hours from Washington, D.C. It got passed in 2004. And this really launched this issue into the national headlines. This was Time magazine. It got on the cover of Time, the evolution wars. Here, all of these states that are colored in were having fights about teaching evolution. The blue dots were local school districts that were having fights about teaching evolution. And this Pandas and People textbook was the pro-intelligent design book that was being pushed in the schools. And here's the quote: intelligent design means the various forms of life begin abruptly through an intelligent agency with their distinctive features already intact: fish with fins and scales, birds with feathers, beaks and wings, etc. All right, so that's what was being taught. And the idea was that Dover passed this. They passed a policy that said that the school district had to include these books in the biology classroom, and the teachers would have to read a pro-intelligent design statement. The teachers actually refused to do it. They were backed by the union, and parents of the students in Dover filed a lawsuit against the school board to say that this was an unconstitutional violation of their rights because this was another example of creation science, basically pushing a particular religious view, which is unconstitutional. All right, so this led to the court case, Kitzmiller versus Dover. And you can see these attorneys. These are some ACLU attorneys and private attorneys assisting the ACLU. And then I was there working for the National Center for Science Education as kind of an advisor. And so I'm here in the background of this photo, which is a little bit interesting. I was just there to be the kind of the science nerd on this case. There was a lot of press at this trial. Here's those attorneys again. And here I am up in the corner. It was quite a event. This guy, this bald head here, is actually Charles Darwin's great-great-grandson, who was a journalist, and he came to the trial as well. So he actually looks a little bit like Darwin. It was a little bit freaky to have this ghost of Darwin at this trial. Here is a courtroom artist drawing. There were no cameras in the courtroom. There's Judge John Jones, and here is the author of the mainstream biology textbook, Kenneth Miller. You may have had his biology textbook in high school. He's got a very popular textbook, even internationally, although it's particularly big in the US. I think it has 40% market share in the US. And here are the attorneys, and then here I am in the background. So I was even in the background of this courtroom artist drawing, being kind of the nerd on call for the lawyers. We got some good rulings out of this case. The trial went for 6 weeks. There's a ton of media on it. There's several books about it. We brought a lot of expert witnesses, which we'll talk about in a second. But we got a couple important rulings. The judge ruled that intelligent design was not science, right? This was important because only to rebut the claim from the intelligent design proponents that they claimed that intelligent design was science, not religion, and therefore it would be legal, constitutional to teach it in a government school. That was the claim, and so we had to rebut that. And how did we rebut that? Well, we used slides like this one. The intelligent design movement and the Pandas and People textbook they were using claimed that there were no transitional fossils. So we had a paleontologist come testify and actually show us, actual photos of fossils, like fossils representing the evolution of whales, like Ambulocetus here. Ambulocetus just means walking whale. And you can go see this, and if you're ever in Melbourne, go to the Melbourne Museum, you can see one of these on display. We have actual fossils of whales, things that are clearly aquatic, but they still have 4 limbs. We also looked at things like the homology argument, right? We've talked in class about homology is essentially representing some shared pattern, especially if it's independent of function, some shared similarity that isn't explained by just functional similarity. Why did those similarities exist? Well, it means they're evidence of shared history and therefore common ancestry. Now, the Pandas book doesn't like this. The intelligent design people don't like common ancestry usually. So they argue, well, convergence disproves homology. And they say, look at the Tasmanian wolf or the Tasmanian tiger, and look at the skull of a placental dog. So the marsupial wolf, right, the Tasmanian devil, the thylacine, not the Tasmanian devil, the Tasmanian tiger is the thylacine. It's a marsupial, but it looks a lot like a dog or a wolf, and their skulls look kind of superficially similar. So the Pandas book says this disproves these homology arguments. But when you actually look at them overall, and you analyze their morphology in detail, and we had our paleontologists go through this in detail, they're actually, the thylacine is a lot more like sort of a giant carnivorous possum than it is a dog or a wolf. It's got a much different body structure. And even you can tell just from a skull. You don't have to have pouches or something to tell if something's a marsupial. You just got to do things like count the number of molars. Marsupials have 4 molars. That's a shared characteristic of marsupials. Wolves and dogs, placental mammals have 2 back molars and 4 premolars. So these tooth formulae are enough to classify these things. There's a variety of other discrete characters that can be identified on these skulls that are shared by marsupials or placental mammals. So you can identify them. Here's another set. So the wolf and the Tasmanian wolf have different numbers of premolars and molars. The dog and the North American wolf, right, have the same number. They have 2 molars, 4 premolars, etc. Kangaroos, on the other hand, have the 4 molars, just like the Tasmanian wolf does, because Tasmanian wolf and the kangaroo are marsupials. So these shared characters, these are just like other characters we've discussed in class, and these were being discussed in front of a federal judge, in a courtroom who probably hadn't had biology since his own high school experience, right? So it was quite a bizarre trial. There were other pieces of evidence that were presented. This one was about the immune system. I actually gathered this from the UC Berkeley Library. One of the intelligent design witnesses had claimed that there was no published evidence for the evolution of the immune system. So I went and looked up books and articles on the evolution of the immune system, and these were actually presented to the intelligent design witness in the court case. And it was this sort of bizarre movie moment of cross-examination, right, where he kept getting asked, is this enough evidence? Is this enough evidence? And he kept saying it wasn't good enough. All right, so, now I've skipped. Slide here. Okay, so we had some other pieces of evidence here, just showing that intelligent design wasn't science, proved part of our case, but the main piece of evidence was, is ID, creationism in disguise? Is this intelligent design stuff just creationism in disguise? And that's the positive argument that we had to make. And how do we show that? Well, We actually had drafts of the intelligent design book, drafts that I had helped discover. These were unknown drafts. You can read articles about how this happened. It was quite a bizarre instance of historical deduction. But basically, if you look at the drafts of this book, you can see that the published version uses the term intelligent design, but the older versions of this book use the word creation or creationism instead. So instead of intelligent design means that various forms of life began abruptly through an intelligent agency, the earlier version said creation means that various forms of life began abruptly through the agency of an intelligent creator, right? And so it's pretty clear what happened. The words were switched around 1987. There's intelligent creator got replaced with intelligent agency or intelligent designer. I actually did a word count on the instances of these words throughout the drafts. And you can see that the red line of creationist terminology drops almost to zero. And the blue line, intelligent design terminology, just explodes in between two 1987 drafts. And the, what happened in 1987 was there was a US Supreme Court case over the constitutionality of teaching creation science, and the creationists lost. So creation science was sunk as a legal strategy. And this book had been in development in the early 80s. And they said, well, we need to change the marketing technique here. We'll change the word creationism out and put in the word intelligent design. Change terms like creation to terms like intelligent design. There's various cognates of those words. And so it was a wholesale switcheroo in the words. And this was presented to the judge in addition. Here's one more piece of evidence. We actually didn't use this in court because it was just too much. But if you look at these words, creationists, 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 throughout the drafts, and then in 1987, there was co-design proponentsists, right? So clearly the creationists were going through their textbook, replacing the word creationists with design proponents, but here they did an incomplete paste operation. And this was with an early word processing program on a 1980s era computer. Probably it was WordPerfect, I think is the name of that program back then. This is pre-Windows, right? This is early days, but copy paste, preserved in the draft. All right, so we called this the missing link because it's hilarious, and I still can't believe it was that clear. All right, so we got some good headlines when we won this case. The evidence was overwhelming, and like I said, this went on for 6 weeks. It was really quite a remarkable thing to see. Darwin scores in Pennsylvania court. The judge said that creationism masked as intelligent design has no place in the biology classroom. And the judge also said, we find that the secular purposes claimed by the board amount to a pretext for the board's real purpose, which was to promote religion in the public school classroom in violation of the Establishment Clause. All right, and so the cartoonists loved this too. There's the sort of walking fish walking out of the water. Welcome in Dover, Pennsylvania. Now, and that's just a short version of that talk. I could go on and on about that forever. What's interesting is that after that 2005 court case, creationism didn't just totally disappear, although it did take a big hit from that. The anti-evolution strategies kept being proposed and kept evolving. So the academic freedom bills, the next collection of anti-evolution legislation were known as academic freedom acts. And my point here was that we knew for quite a while, looking at these acts, they're proposed in different state legislatures. There's 50 different states in the US. Each state legislature can pass whatever laws they want. When we started hearing about these bills, we noticed that they had similar texts, right? And these bills seemed to be being copied and passed around. And so this had been noticed informally, but I decided after these had accumulated for 10 years, and it was sort of the 10th anniversary of the Kitzmiller versus Dover case, I decided to do a actual phylogenetic analysis of this copying history. All right, so this was the kind of analysis that I did. First, this wasn't the phylogenetic analysis, but this was just pointing out the similarities in anti-evolution strategies over the decades. So in addition to just teaching creationism or banning the teaching of evolution, there are a variety of other strategies. One common one is to call evolution a theory, not a fact. And that one was used in Dover, Pennsylvania. It was used in Georgia in the 2000s. It's been used a lot of places, but it goes all the way back to California State Board of Education in 1924 passed a policy saying that evolution should be taught as theory, not fact. Using balanced treatment language, we need equal time for creation, science, and evolution. The intelligent design language is, of course, one. Claiming academic freedom goes way back. Claiming it's just our academic freedom to teach creationism. That's an interesting claim. Academic freedom is originally defined. Academic freedom isn't about high schools. Academic freedom is the province of professors at universities. Actual active researchers are the ones who have academic freedom. Let's see. There's a variety of other anti-evolution strategies, including some of these bills say that they just say evolution is controversial. But other ones include other topics. They also say global warming is controversial or cloning is controversial. And here's that full table assessing. I had a database of about 60 anti-evolution policies proposed and occasionally passed in various states between 2004 and 2015. What did I say? 67 codable bills. So here's an example of how this coding worked. I had to treat each of these documents like it was a fossil, right? So you take your fossil or your DNA sequence, and you have to describe the variable features. And so I had to code these up in discrete characters in the character matrix. And just like you would take a kangaroo skull and count how many molars there are and how many premolars there are, and call those characters, and count where do the blood vessels enter the palate at the roof of the mouth. That's a character. You score all of these obscure characters as ones and zeros and put them into a data matrix. So just to show you how this looks, I looked across several Alabama bills from 2004 to 2006, and they clearly have related text, but it's clearly being modified, right? So 2004, they say students are not expressly provided a right to a position on biological or physical origins. In 2005, they say students are not expressly provided a right to a position on scientific views, so they're making it more vague. 2006, they say students are not expressly provided to a right to positions on views. So this is just, they're trying to water it down to avoid court scrutiny, right? But if you look at the history, you can sort of see what they originally meant, and they're trying to hang on to it while avoiding, saying anything too specific that could get them challenged in court. Here's another one, 2011, 2012. Let's see. They basically say some of these topics cause debate and disputation, including but not limited to biological evolution, chemical origins of life, global warming, and human cloning. Whereas in 2012, this turns into biological evolution, chemical origins of life, random mutation, natural selection, DNA, and fossil discoveries can cause controversy, right? So if you were coding this up, you'd say, well, okay, there's a shared characteristic here. They both mention the term biological evolution. They both mention chemical origins of life. And then there's some new changes here. The second bill here mentions random mutation, mentions natural selection, DNA. So these are traits that are found in the second bill, but not in the first one. So by coding up these words, and it was always a specific phrase, basically, a specific objectively describable characteristic of a particular bill is what I put in. So here's what my data matrix looked like. This is just part of it. This massive Excel file where I lined up all the bills, sort of did a DNA alignment on them almost, and then coded up the characteristics. Here's what the data matrix looks like. This is a Nexus file. You can load it in the program Nexus. It's online on the that sort of website I sent around about the evolution of anti-evolutionism. So you can look at this data file in Nexus. And so each of these ones and zeros represents a scored characteristic representing some variable feature between these bills. Question marks are cases where a feature is either you can't tell which state it was in because that section is missing, or it's not applicable to that particular bill. All right, so I had to get this published. So I developed a character matrix, did some phylogenetic analyses, but before you want to publish something like this, that's very unusual, right? When the case is DNA or fossils and you're working in a scientific journal, you don't have to prove that those evolved, right? You can just assume they evolved because everyone agrees in science, agrees that evolution is true. But it's not intrinsically obvious to the reader that these bills evolved in a meaningful way, right? That, for all we know, for all the reader knows, the different people could have written the bills and they just could have sort of randomly had some similarities. So how do you prove that there's actual tree structure in this collection of bills? This was the first thing I had to show. And there actually is a method for doing that. If you have a data set and you're not sure if it has a phylogenetic structure or not, you can do a test, which is where you randomize the data at the tips of the tree. So you just basically randomly swap the characters around, um, but keep the same number of characters and the same number of character states and everything. You're just randomizing within columns. And so you're destroying any tree signal. And then you run a parsimony inference and you count how long those trees are on the identical data, but randomized. And then you see how many character steps it takes to explain that data. So that led to trees that are somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 character steps. And then you take your observed data, non-randomized data, and you ask, well, how many steps does the observed data take to explain? And it actually takes a tree that's much, much shorter, 1,000 steps basically. And so if the non-randomized data, right, has a much shorter length than the randomized data, so basically this has a tree with many fewer steps, that means that many of the steps are shared because they evolved along a tree-like structure, right? Many of those steps were shared amongst a bunch of bills because the bills were copied and modified. And so you'll get, in this sense, a shorter tree, meaning a tree where the data is explained with a fewer number of character changes, which is all that parsimony means. And if you can show that you're well below the distribution of the randomized data, then you have a pretty good argument that you actually have tree structure in your data. All right, so how does this inference of a tree, how do you infer a copying history from a series of characteristics? Well, basically you can propose a tree, and if you have different tips that have different dates, so data tips A, B, and C, you can have a character change occur somewhere along that tree. And this would be a one step if you're doing a parsimony analysis, or if you're doing a likelihood or Bayesian analysis, there'd be a certain probability of a change happening along this branch. We've talked a lot about those probabilities in the course. You have a rate matrix for a particular character. You can quantify the probabilities under an assumed rate. You can say what the probability of a character change is at any point along the tree. And anyway, basically tips that share characteristics tend to be better explained by trees that postulate that change occurring once in the common ancestor rather than occurring twice, independently on the two different branches. So that applies in a parsimony phylogenetics or in a likelihood of Bayesian phylogenetics. It gives you similar evidence. And this is simply because it's basically easier to explain your data by just postulating one change that's then inherited by both copies. All right, and the copying events, right, are these what we would call speciation events, but in a phylogeny of texts, right, these splitting events are essentially a copy is produced and perhaps modified, and then more copies are produced. All right, so this led to this, this is the journalist picked up the article once it was published, the evolution of anti-evolution policy, how to annoy a creationist in one complicated chart. So basically we have the anti-evolution bills by date and by state. So really they all started in Alabama in 2004, AL, but it went on and on. They spread all around the country, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, Montana, Tennessee, and then one actually did pass in Tennessee in 2011. And another one passed, sort of really watered down one passed in Mississippi. And these bills, the problem with them was they were pretty vague, right? And so they've never been challenged in court because they were pretty vague, but they would just call evolution controversial, basically. But I haven't seen any new ones since this article was published. So maybe the strategy is dying out, or maybe the sort of radical right in the US has moved on to other topics with the sort of, in the Trumpism years. That's sort of what I suspect, is that they've moved on to even crazier topics than creationism. I kind of wish creationism was still the main topic. Like that was a sort of nobler age in a sense compared to the fights that are going on now. All right, so anyway, I did a parsimony analysis, but I also did a beast analysis to get a data tree, right? So I had to postulate a bunch of things. This was a Bayesian analysis with beast 2, much like the one you did with, I think, yellow fever virus. We used the birth death sampled ancestors tree model. So we had a birth rate and a death rate, right? And the birth rate you would have to interpret as a copying rate. The death rate, what's the interpretation of that? It basically means what's the chance that the bill won't be copied again. right? Because a bunch of these bills didn't really serve as the basis for further copies. Um, you know, I'm not totally sure if I'm happy with that interpretation, because a text, it's not like a text dies, a text just sits there and somebody else could pick it up later and copy it. But it is, if you're going to have a birth rate, you have to have some kind of a death rate. And so I treat it a little bit as a nuisance parameter without putting too much interpretive weight on it. The sampling rate is really just the rate at which bills are published, because we sampled all of the published bills. For all we know, there could have been additional copies, right, that were unpublished, but the published ones are what gets stuck into, every state has a database of all of the proposed legislation. So you can't see the hidden copies that are in people's desks and things, but the ones that actually got into the record of the state legislature, we have all of those. So that's really the rate of those accumulating. In what sense does it mean that to apply a model to a copying process like this? Well, we had to postulate a relaxed morphological clock. So you know about molecular clocks, the idea that on average for some molecules, the rate of DNA or protein amino acid substitution is roughly constant. You can make the same assumption for morphological data or discrete character data or even changes in the text. Whether that assumption is correct or not is really an empirical question. And here, because we had so many dates, we actually could test this. And I did get reasonable support for the idea that these bills were changing at a roughly constant average rate. We have a relaxed clock, so we don't have to postulate that they're, that process is completely uniform. It doesn't have to be a strict clock, but you can apply a relaxed clock, and that seemed to work reasonably well on these data. So what kinds of things do we see on this data tree? I used the tree once I had it to map the origins of different characteristics. And so one of the big ones was, when did the traditional enemy, evolution and the origin of life, when did they get merged with human cloning and global warming as controversial topics? And really, it's the red lines here where evolution of life and evolution, or origin of life and evolution, are linked to global warming and human cloning. That's the red part of the tree here. And that really happened in 2006. First policy that did that was introduced. And really, it was this a policy not at a state legislature, but at a county level called Washtenaw Parish, Louisiana. This is a really right-wing school district that has innovated a lot of strange sort of right-wing ideas. But this particular one was really successful. They basically merged their language into the Academic Freedom Acts that had been promoted in Alabama and elsewhere, and created kind of a new monster bill that then really became the basis of the next laws that spread around the country. The older ones, just the pure Academic Freedom Acts, kind of died out. New ones were called Science Education Acts, and they were passed in Louisiana in 2008 and in Tennessee in 2011. And a really, really watered down one was passed in Mississippi as well. But you can see that this was kind of almost the gene fusion event, right, that produced a new lineage. We could trace the evolution of other characteristics. The actual state, the geographic political state in which a bill started in, can be mapped like a character state in an evolutionary analysis. And so I did that, and you can see here, I mean, it was obvious just by looking at it, but you can see here that Alabama was the origin of this whole topic. Then the bill moved over to Florida, moved to Oklahoma, and the Oklahoma one got copied into New Mexico and Florida and elsewhere. Dark blue is Louisiana, yeah. So it moved into Louisiana, which kind of became the ancestor of these other places. Louisiana is where the Washtenaw Parish language got merged in. Louisiana was the ancestor of the past Louisiana bill. And then that one got copied to places like Kentucky, as well as Tennessee, which is orange. And of course, it passed in Tennessee. And then the one that passed in Tennessee itself got copied to some other states. Now, at this point, I really should do an update on this. I haven't heard much about bills after this, but there probably are some. So it'd be interesting to do an updated analysis. We can look at other tactics in the bills, like some of the bills are called Academic Freedom Acts, some of them are called Science Education Acts. Basically, the early Alabama ones were called Academic Freedom Acts, that's the white. The Science Education ones were this sort of teal color here. A few of them had both characteristics, right? This green. So you're starting to see how this is a process. The gradual acquisition of character states is very much like a copying process that happens with DNA or with morphological characteristics in fossils, right? Character states change one by one, usually, and by tracing that history, you can estimate the phylogeny or trace the history of an individual characteristic. Here's another one. Do they talk about chemical? This is trivial, but does the bill talk about chemical evolution or chemical origins? The early ones talked about chemical evolution. Then in 2006, they switched to chemical origins, and that was inherited by most of the descendant bills. Right, so you can look quite precisely when did individual innovations start. All right, so I wrote this up, a popular version. I've sent around the science article, but a popular version was written up in Australasian Science in 2016. Intelligent Design Evolved, so you can read that if you like. And I had a few lessons here. History is important, documentation is important, education must be supported at all levels. So, none of this work or none of the work on the Kitzmiller case would have been successful without really careful documentation of the history of these particular anti-evolution strategies. So I always like to say, if you're interested in defending science and defending science education, you have to do your research, not just to know your science, to know your opposition, right? You have to really nail down who is saying what when, and are they justified in saying it, and where did they get their information from? Where did they get their claims from? Because very often the pseudoscience material it's not most people's, well thought out beliefs. It's basically people who have political problems with some aspect of science, and they're just copying stuff that they've heard. Right? They don't have their sort of own detailed research tradition and their own knowledge base to back this up. They're making claims for political purposes, and they're just copying propaganda that they've heard. And so by tracing the history of that copying, you can find out interesting things that can actually help your activism case. All right. What else is in here? Yeah, that's about it. I have a little bit on Australian creationists because one of the most famous US creationists is actually an Australian. But I will leave it there. Thanks for listening. And hopefully this gives you a little bit of background if you read that paper, and you can you see a really unusual application of Bayesian phylogenetics. All right, so thanks, and I'll take questions when I see you in person. Thanks, bye.